Morning came quietly to Grant Mountain Lodge, the kind of soft Colorado dawn that usually eased Eleanor Grant into her day. She moved through the familiar wooden corridors with a light touch, brushing her fingertips across railings she and her husband had sanded and stained together decades earlier. The air smelled of pine and coffee, her routine anchors steady and unchanged. At least that's what she believed. She expected to find Thomas in the kitchen or on the front porch, reading the newspaper, the way he had for years. But the porch was empty. The kitchen lights were off. A small unease pressed at the back of her mind as she made her way toward the sitting room facing the eastern ridge. Before she even stepped through the doorway, she heard a low laugh, soft, youthful, unfamiliar in that space. When she turned the corner, she stopped cold. Thomas was standing far too close to Kayla Monroe, the young woman who was supposed to become their daughter-in-law. Kayla's hand rested on his chest, and Thomas didn't move it away. Their faces were inches apart, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The world didn't explode, it didn't even tilt. It simply fractured, a clean, silent break inside Eleanor's chest. No gasp, no cry, just a sudden stillness, as though her entire body forgot how to exist for a moment. Thomas jerked back when he noticed her in the doorway, but Kayla didn't. Her expression shifted only slightly, a quick flash of annoyance before she masked it with surprise. Eleanor couldn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth was already standing in front of her. She turned away mechanically, feeling the weight of the lodge pressing in on her from all sides. As she stepped into the main hallway, she nearly collided with her son. Daniel Grant stood there, frozen, his expression already hollowed by something deeper than shock. He didn't ask what she saw. He didn't need to. His eyes said he had seen it too. He touched her elbow gently. "Mom," he whispered, voice thin but controlled. "Come with me." He guided her through the side door onto the back porch. The mountains stretched out endlessly before them, quiet and indifferent, their peaks catching the first blush of sunrise. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, not against the cold, but against the shudder rising from somewhere deep inside. Daniel exhaled shakily, bracing himself. "I've known," he said, "about them. For 3 months." The words didn't fall like a blow. They settled, heavy and slow, sinking deeper into the fracture inside her. He explained, quietly, carefully, that he had been gathering evidence, watching, waiting, trying to understand why his father and fiancée had betrayed them both. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She only stood there, staring at the mountains she had loved all her life, feeling them recede just slightly, as if the ground beneath everything she knew had begun to shift. A morning like any other had ended, and something far more devastating had begun. The hallway outside the back porch was too bright, too ordinary for the kind of truth Daniel carried in his eyes. Without speaking, he led Eleanor through the lodge, past framed photographs of family holidays, renovations, anniversaries, moments now recast in a harsher light. They stopped at Thomas's old home office, a room Thomas rarely used in recent years, but never allowed anyone else to touch. Daniel closed the door behind them. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old paper. He crossed to the desk and pulled open the bottom drawer, removing a thick folder secured with a rubber band. "I didn't want to show you this," he said quietly, "but after this morning, you need to see it." He laid the folder on the desk. Eleanor stared at it, her pulse slow and strangely distant. When Daniel opened it, the first page slid out, an official-looking document bearing her name in bold print. Her signature sat neatly at the bottom, except she had never signed it. "It's a transfer authorization," Daniel murmured. "Dad and Kayla filed it through a shell company called Grant Ridge Holdings, LLC. It doesn't really exist. Just a mailbox in Denver tied to an online registry service." He pulled out another sheet, then another. Each one had her name, forged with unsettling precision. Deeds, consent forms, notices of intended sale. Her handwriting mimicked down to the curl of her initials. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she touched one page. It felt like ice. Daniel continued, his voice steady but thick. Kayla helped him. Before she met me. She worked for Alpine Ridge Development Group, the same corporation that's been trying to buy up land near the park for years. They've been eyeing this lodge for a long time. She was their way in. He spread a series of printed emails across the desk. Eleanor could see Kayla's name in the headers, Thomas's in the threads that followed. Discussions about valuations, target closing dates, compensation percentages, strategies to keep Eleanor unaware until the deal clears. Every email was a blade, every photo a wound, documents signed in her name, photographed by Daniel on nights when he searched Thomas's office in silence. Images of Kayla meeting with Alpine Ridge representatives in parking lots. Text messages between her and Thomas planning the transition. Eleanor's breath tightened. Slow and shallow. It wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure, deliberate and calculated. Daniel watched her carefully. I tried to confront Kayla weeks ago, he admitted, but I realized if I said anything, they would have rushed the sale. I needed time to gather proof. I needed to protect you. She sank into Thomas's old chair, the leather cool beneath her hands. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in, as though 40 years of marriage were collapsing in quiet, suffocating layers. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She only stared at the evidence spread before her. Pages that turned the life she'd built into something fragile and unfamiliar. A betrayal far colder than she ever imagined had been unfolding beneath her feet. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself before he continued. He moved around the desk, gathering the remaining documents from the drawer, papers worn at the edges, as though he had handled them too many times while deciding whether to bring them to his mother. There's more you need to know, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, though her hands remained motionless on her lap. She felt as if her body belonged to someone else, someone watching from a distance, someone trying to understand how a lifetime could be dismantled without a sound. Daniel placed a new set of pages in front of her. Kayla didn't meet me by accident, he said. She targeted me. The words landed without drama, without shock, just a deeper sinking, like a stone settling at the bottom of a lake. She applied for a job here 2 years ago, Daniel went on. Not because she loved Estes Park. Not because she wanted a fresh start. She knew Alpine Ridge wanted this land, and she knew Dad was frustrated, wanted a different life, something bigger. They saw potential in him, someone easy to pull in. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Kayla knew I was coming back from Portland after culinary school. She followed everything I posted online. She knew who I was, what this lodge meant, how much Dad handled the finances alone. She played a long game. Mom. Eleanor's eyes lowered to a signature. Her signature, on a document transferring partial ownership of the lodge to Grant Ridge Holdings, LLC. The strokes were perfect. Too perfect. She and Dad created the company together, Daniel continued, voice now a steady hum of truth. They used your forged signature to give it authority. Then they scheduled the sale through Alpine Ridge. Kayla would handle negotiations from the inside, and Dad would authorize everything from here. He lifted another page, an itinerary printed and folded. 2 one-way tickets to Europe. Departure, Denver International Airport. Destination, Lisbon. Date, 3 weeks from now. They plan to disappear right after the closing, Daniel said. Cash out, leave everything behind. Leave you behind. Silence settled like snowfall, soft but heavy enough to bend the spine. Eleanor didn't reach for the papers. She simply stared at the itinerary, at the proof that her husband and future daughter-in-law had not only betrayed her heart, but had mapped out a world where she didn't exist at all. Her life's work, the lodge she and Thomas had built from the ground up, the beams they had sanded together, the late nights they spent checking in guests during snowstorms, was nothing more than a commodity to be flipped and abandoned. No tears came, no trembling. Her stillness was almost frightening in its clarity. Daniel knelt beside her chair. "Mom," he whispered, "this wasn't just an affair. They wanted everything. The lodge, the land, the money, your name." He hesitated before adding the final truth. "And then they planned a life without us." Eleanor's gaze stayed fixed on the mountains framed by the office window, peaks that had always seemed eternal, immovable. But now even they felt distant, blurred by the sharp, quiet realization that her world had already been shifting beneath her long before this morning. The full weight of the conspiracy settled into place, devastating, unembellished, and coldly real. Eleanor remained seated in Thomas's office long after the last page was set down. Daniel stood nearby, watching her carefully, searching her face for any sign of collapse. But she didn't break. She simply inhaled once, slow and controlled, before looking up at him with a clarity that had not been there before. "What do we do now?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "We fight back." It wasn't anger that drove his voice, just resolve, firm and steady, the kind that came from months of silent preparation. He gathered the folder, slid every document back into place, and closed the office door behind them. Within an hour, they were on the road to Fort Collins. The drive wound through the canyon, sunlight slipping across the river as the mountains opened around them. Eleanor watched the landscape pass by, feeling both numb and sharpened. She had spent her life building something solid. Now she was heading toward someone who could help her keep it from being stolen. They arrived at a modest building tucked between two fir trees, Hale and Winter's Law Group. Inside, attorney Stephen Hale greeted them with a firm handshake. He was in his mid-40s, with the kind of calm expression that suggested he had seen countless cases of betrayal and fraud, yet never rushed a single one. Daniel set the folder on Hale's desk. "We need help," he said simply. Hale leafed through the documents with methodical precision. Page by page his brow tightened, not in surprise but in confirmation. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the weight of legal certainty. "The forged signature alone," he said, tapping the first document, "is a felony in Colorado. This isn't a gray area. It's deliberate fraud." Eleanor exhaled quietly, as if acknowledging something she had known but resisted accepting. Hale continued, "The shell company, Grant Ridge Holdings, LLC, was created solely to transfer your property without your consent, combined with the planned sale to Alpine Ridge. This constitutes attempted unlawful transfer of real estate." He sat back slightly. "You have enough evidence to freeze everything." Daniel leaned forward. "How?" "We'll file a temporary restraining order," Hale explained, "to prevent any further action on the property. And a lease pendens, a notice attached to the lodge's title, alerting any potential buyer that the ownership is in dispute. It stops the sale in its tracks." Eleanor absorbed the words, feeling a steadiness return to her bones. Hale's tone sharpened, just slightly. "But I need you both to understand something critical." They looked at him. "Do not let them know you know," he said. "If Thomas or Kayla suspects even for a second that you're moving legally against them, they'll rush whatever comes next. Destroy documents, transfer funds, flee. Your silence is your advantage." The room fell still. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was survival, careful, strategic, and absolutely necessary. And for the first time since the morning shattered her world, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her begin to hold. Returning to Grant Mountain Lodge felt different now. Its wooden beams, warm lighting, and familiar floors suddenly sharper, heavier, as though every piece of the place sensed the shift beneath the surface. Eleanor walked through the entryway with the same calm steps she had practiced for decades. But inside, everything felt brittle. She had to hold her face still, breathe evenly, and pretend her world hadn't cracked open just hours earlier. She had to live under the same roof as the two people who were dismantling her life. The next morning, she moved through the kitchen the way she always did, setting out plates and brewing coffee. Thomas arrived first, offering a cheerfulness too polished, too quick. Like someone performing a role he no longer remembered how to play naturally. "Morning," he said lightly, reaching for the coffee pot. Eleanor answered with a quiet nod. Their eyes didn't meet. Moments later, Kayla joined them, her presence slicing through the room like a draft. She greeted Eleanor with forced warmth, her smile stretched too wide. The young woman poured herself coffee and sat beside Thomas, subtly leaning in toward him in a way no one else would notice, unless they already knew the truth. The silence at the table felt alive. Eleanor pushed food across her plate without tasting it, every clink of silverware magnified. Thomas attempted small talk about lodge maintenance, the upcoming tourist season, the weather. Each word felt like a stone skipping across a hidden lake of secrets. Then Daniel entered the room. He carried himself with a controlled steadiness, the kind that gave nothing away. He sat, picked up his fork, and waited for the right moment. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost casual. "I've been thinking," he said, "and I'd like to postpone the wedding." The impact was immediate, though carefully concealed. Kayla froze mid-bite. Her lashes fluttered once, a tiny stutter of panic. She recovered quickly, placing her fork down with exaggerated gentleness. "Postpone," she repeated with a soft laugh. "Why would we do that, Danny?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "Timing doesn't feel right. Too much happening with the lodge. We should wait." Thomas stiffened, then forced a smile. "Son, you've been planning for months. Why change things now?" Daniel kept his expression neutral. "It's my decision." The silence returned, sharper this time. Kayla's gaze darted downward, then toward Thomas, a flicker of unspoken fear passing between them. She masked it with a sip of coffee, but her hand trembled faintly. Eleanor observed everything without lifting her eyes from her plate. Breakfast became a battlefield disguised as routine. Every glance a test, every pause a signal. The house around them functioned as usual. Guests checked in, staff cleaned rooms. The front door opened and closed. But underneath, the lodge felt split cleanly in two. On the surface, calm, polite conversations, warm lights, and the illusion of harmony. Beneath it, a war of secrets, quiet, suffocating, shifting like fault lines no one dared step on too hard. And Eleanor moved through it all with the steady grace of someone who understood that silence, for now, was her greatest weapon. Night settled over Grant Mount Lodge with a heavy stillness, the kind that usually soothed Eleanor after long days of work. But tonight the quiet felt sharper, too deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. Guests had retreated to their rooms, the hallways dimmed, and only the faint hum of the heater filled the silence. Eleanor made her way toward the linen closet at the far end of the second floor. She moved slowly, her steps soft on the carpet, trying to maintain the rhythm of someone who believed everything in her home was still intact. She reached for a set of fresh towels, then paused. A voice drifted from a nearby guest room. "Kayla's. We can't wait any longer," she hissed, low and urgent. "If she's starting to suspect something, everything falls apart. We need to sell now." Eleanor's hand froze midair. Thomas answered, his tone tense but subdued. "I told you we have to be careful. If we push too fast, someone will notice. The documents aren't all finalized yet." Kayla scoffed, the sound sharp, brittle. "You said she never pays attention to the finances. You said she'd sign anything if you framed it as lodge maintenance or renovations." But what if she figured something out? Daniel is acting strange. The wedding postponement, something's off. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. She wasn't supposed to hear this. She was never meant to know how casually they discussed her, how easily they assumed her ignorance. Thomas lowered his voice, though the strain carried through. We have to delay until the payout is guaranteed. Once the funds hit the account, we're gone. But if we rush, Eleanor could spot something. Or worse, talk to someone. Kayla's reply came quick, frantic. And what if Alpine Ridge pulls out? They're already impatient. They want that land and they want it soon. If the sale stalls, they'll move on. Thomas exhaled in frustration. Just hold it together a little longer. Kayla didn't respond. The tension in the room went silent, thick and poisonous. Eleanor backed away quietly, her fingers gripping the towels like anchors. She forced herself to keep breathing steadily. If she broke now, if they heard her, everything would unravel. She moved down the hallway with practiced calm, though each step felt like she was walking across cracking ice. When she reached her bedroom, she closed the door gently and leaned against it, letting the truth settle around her like cold air. The timeline had shrunk. The danger was no longer distant or theoretical. It was pressing in fast, tightening around them. Moments later, Daniel knocked softly. He stepped inside, reading her expression instantly. "They're trying to sell earlier," she whispered. "They're afraid we know." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we have to move faster." The noose was tightening, quietly, relentlessly, and there was no more time to wait. The call came just after sunrise. Eleanor was in the kitchen, rinsing berries for the breakfast service, when her phone buzzed with Attorney Stephen Hale's number. She wiped her hands, stepped into the pantry for privacy, and answered. "Mrs. Grant," Hale said, his voice steady, professional, and unmistakably decisive. The judge approved both filings. The temporary restraining order is active, and the lease pendens has been recorded with the county clerk. As of this morning, Grant Mountain Lodge cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered in any way. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the words settle. A breath she didn't realize she'd been holding left her body slowly. "So the lodge is safe?" she whispered. "For now, yes," Hale replied, "but only if they remain unaware. The moment they sense resistance, they'll try to work around it. Keep everything exactly as it has been." When the call ended, Eleanor stepped back into the kitchen with the same calm expression she'd worn for days. Daniel entered moments later, and she gave him a small nod, the signal they'd agreed on. His shoulders loosened imperceptibly. One battle line had been drawn, even if Thomas and Kayla had no idea the war had already begun. Throughout the next few days, Eleanor and Daniel worked quietly but relentlessly. After guests checked out, they moved through rarely used storage closets, sorting old receipts, property records, tax filings, and years of financial paperwork that Thomas had always insisted on handling alone. They compiled everything Hale might need: proof of ownership, documentation of Eleanor's involvement in the lodge, discrepancies in Thomas's signatures. They worked like ghosts in their own home, never drawing attention, always listening for footsteps. At the same time, the atmosphere inside Grant Mountain Lodge thickened. Thomas and Kayla became more cautious. Their conversations clipped and quiet. They whispered behind half-closed doors, paused abruptly when someone walked by, and exchanged glances filled with nerves they didn't attempt to hide well. One afternoon, as Eleanor polished the dining room tables, she overheard them speaking in the corner near the staircase. "I don't like this," Kayla muttered. "Daniel's been around too much. Eleanor keeps disappearing for hours at a time. Something's wrong." Thomas hushed her sharply. "We stay patient. Once the funds clear, we walk out the door. But we can't draw attention now. Not when it matters most." Kayla sighed, but didn't push further. Her eyes drifted across the lobby, scanning for signs of what Eleanor didn't know. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. Eleanor continued, wiping the surface of the table with smooth, practiced motions. She didn't look up. She didn't break the rhythm. She had mastered the art of moving through her own home without disturbing the fragile balance. Each evening, she and Daniel met in her room with the door locked, quietly sorting files, marking timelines, reviewing evidence. Their whispers were low, measured, their preparations deliberate. The legal nets were in place. The lodge was protected, but the silence within its walls was stretching thinner by the hour. And everyone inside could feel the shift, though only Eleanor and Daniel knew exactly what was coming next. 2 days later, the tension inside Grant Mountain Lodge shifted from quiet unease to a sharp, humming anticipation. Eleanor sensed at the moment she stepped into the lobby. Thomas had dressed in his nicer jacket, the one he reserved for professional meetings. Kayla hovered near him, pacing with a restless energy she failed to hide. By late morning, 2 men in tailored coats walked through the front doors, representatives from Alpine Ridge Development Group. Their arrival confirmed what Eleanor and Daniel already knew. Thomas had pushed ahead with the meeting, ignoring every sign of risk, desperate to keep the sale on track. Mr. Grant, one of them asked, "We're here for the site review and contract review." Thomas greeted them with a broad, rehearsed smile, ushering them toward the sitting room, the very room where this had all begun. Kayla followed closely, clutching a slim folder and biting at her thumbnail. Eleanor watched from the reception desk. She exchanged a glance with Daniel, who stood by the staircase. It was a silent understanding. This was the moment. The men began spreading documents across the coffee table, valuation reports, proposed renovation plans, projected development timelines. Thomas leaned in, animated and eager, speaking quickly as though afraid the opportunity would vanish if he didn't fill every second with persuasion. Kayla chimed in with corporate jargon, echoing phrases Eleanor recognized from the emails Daniel had shown her. Halfway through Thomas's pitch, Eleanor stepped forward. "Gentlemen," she said, voice steady, calm, unwavering, "this property is not for sale." The room fell silent. Thomas blinked, confusion flickering across his face before he forced another smile. "Eleanor, maybe we should talk about this later." Daniel entered the room and stood beside his mother. "There is no sale," he repeated. "No negotiation. No future meeting." The Alpine Ridge representatives exchanged puzzled looks. One cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant said the ownership had already been transferred to your holding company, that everything was approved." Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "Nothing has been transferred. Nothing has been authorized. And no legitimate document exists that would allow a sale." The men hesitated. Something in Eleanor's voice, calm yet unshakably firm, made them close their folders. They turned to Thomas. "Is there a misunderstanding here?" one asked. Thomas's facade slipped, just slightly. His jaw clenched, eyes darting between Eleanor and Daniel. "There's no misunderstanding," he said tightly. "My wife just doesn't understand the arrangements." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor replied. Kayla visibly paled. For the first time, she lost her composure. "What did she do?" she snapped toward Thomas, her voice breaking through its practiced sweetness. "What did she find?" The 2 representatives rose from their seats. Uncomfortable. "It seems this isn't the right time. We'll follow up later." They left quickly, their confusion trailing behind them like a draft. When the door closed, Thomas turned back to Eleanor, his mask no longer fitting. "What are you playing at?" he demanded, but the heat in his voice was tempered by something new, fear. Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. For the first time, Thomas understood. The ground beneath him had shifted, and Eleanor was no longer standing where he expected her to be. The call from Attorney Hale came in the late afternoon. just as the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast long blue shadows across the lodge's lobby. Eleanor stepped into the empty dining room to answer, expecting a routine update. What she heard instead tightened every muscle in her body. "Mrs. Grant," Hale said, voice clipped and urgent. "A large wire transfer was initiated from your joint account early this morning. The funds were sent to a bank in Zurich. And that's not all. We have confirmation of 2 airline tickets, Denver to Madrid, departing tonight." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Cold. Madrid?" Eleanor whispered. "Yes. Under Thomas Grant's name," Hale continued, "and the second ticket is under Kayla Monroe." Eleanor didn't reply immediately. Her hand tightened around the phone until her knuckles whitened. "They're running," Hale said softly. "They're leaving the country before the sale fully collapses. You need to act now." She found Daniel in the hallway outside the office, sorting the last stack of documents for Hale. One look at her face, and he straightened. "What happened?" he asked. "They're leaving tonight," Eleanor said. "Zurich transfer. Tickets to Madrid." Daniel's expression hardened. "Then this is it. We either stop them now, or they disappear before the investigation can touch them." A beat of silence passed before he added, "We need to keep them in town long enough for law enforcement to intervene." He began outlining a plan with the same deliberate calm he had shown from the beginning. Steady, methodical, precise. "You invite Dad to dinner tonight," he said. "Say you want to talk about the lodge. Something emotional. He won't resist. He'll think you're breaking. And Kayla?" Eleanor asked. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on her," Daniel said. "She won't leave without him. She won't risk the plan falling apart." Eleanor exhaled slowly. The idea of sitting across from Thomas, pretending, again, sent a cold shiver down her spine. But there was no alternative. Time was slipping by like water through fingers. "And when they leave the restaurant," Daniel continued, "they'll realize they forgot his wallet at the lodge." His voice sharpened. "They'll have to come back. Together." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "And we'll be here waiting." The plan was simple, but the timing had to be perfect. Too soon and Thomas would bolt. Too late and he'd be on a plane. The next hour moved with a strange, heavy quiet. Eleanor rehearsed her invitation, smoothing her voice into something warm, something familiar. Daniel stationed himself near the front windows, watching for any signs of movement from Kayla. By early evening, the lodge felt like a held breath. The wire transfer, the plane tickets, the hurried whispers, it all pointed to one truth. Thomas and Kayla weren't just betraying her. They were fleeing with the pieces of her life. And tonight would be their last chance to run. Downtown Estes Park shimmered with warm lights as evening settled over the valley. Tourists filled the sidewalks, laughter spilling from cafes and restaurants. But Eleanor felt none of the charm she had always loved about this little mountain town. Tonight, every glowing window felt distant, unreachable, another world entirely. She sat across from Thomas at a small table in a rustic bistro, the kind they used to visit on anniversaries. He had chosen it deliberately, hoping to set a familiar scene, hoping she would soften. Thomas smiled as the waiter poured water. Too quickly, too brightly. "I'm glad you asked me out tonight," he said, folding his napkin with careful, calculated tenderness. "We've both been under stress. The lodge, the wedding, it's easy to misunderstand each other." He leaned forward, voice low and coaxing. "I miss you, Elle." Eleanor watched him, watched the performance. The gentle eyes, the concerned tilt of the head, the soft attempts at nostalgia. All of it carefully crafted, rehearsed, predictable. She let him talk for several minutes. He reminisced about their early years, joked about Daniel's stubbornness, asked about the lodge repairs, as if everything were normal, as if he hadn't already purchased one-way tickets to Madrid, as if he weren't planning to vanish tonight. The waiter filled their glasses and stepped away. The room hummed with quiet conversation. Eleanor set her fork down, hand steady. "Thomas," she said softly. He looked up, mid-sentence. "I know everything." Silence swallowed the table. For a moment, Thomas didn't move. His smile stayed frozen, but his eyes flickered, first confusion, then recognition, and finally something colder. The mask slipped in a clean, sharp motion. What exactly do you think you know?" he asked, voice cracking just slightly. "The affair," Eleanor said. "The shell company. The forged documents. The sale to Alpine Ridge. The wire transfer to Zurich." Her breathing remained even. "And the plane tickets." Panic flashed across his face, raw and unfiltered. "Eleanor, listen. This is being blown out of proportion. You don't understand the business side. I was trying to fix things before telling you." She held a stare. Thomas pushed back in desperation. "This is Daniel, isn't it? He's manipulating you, turning you against me because he never wanted Kayla in the family. He's always been jealous." A vibration interrupted him. Eleanor's phone buzzed on the table. A text from Daniel. "Kayla is packing. 2 men with her. They're taking documents." Her eyes lifted to Thomas. His face drained of color. "Eleanor," he stammered. We need to go home." She stood without another word. Thomas scrambled up, nearly knocking over his chair. He tossed bills onto the table and rushed behind her toward the door, no longer caring about appearances, the restaurant, or the people watching. His facade was gone, shattered in one breath. Outside, cold mountain air swept across the street. Thomas grabbed his keys with shaking hands. "We can fix this," he muttered, trembling as he unlocked the car. "We just have to get back before anything happens." Eleanor slid into the passenger seat, her expression calm, almost eerily still, because she knew the night was no longer about saving anything. It was about exposing everything. The drive back to Grant Mountain Lodge cut through the dark curves of Estes Park like a blade. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched, breathing fast, muttering half-formed excuses under his breath. Eleanor stared out the window, her face still, her pulse steady in a way that felt almost unreal. As they turned onto the long gravel drive, blue and red lights burst through the trees, flashing, silent, undeniable. Police vehicles lined the front of the lodge. Estes Park officers and Larimer County deputies moved with practiced precision, flashlights cutting through the night. Eleanor felt Thomas's breath hitch beside her. What is this?" he whispered. He didn't wait for an answer. He stumbled out of the car, almost tripping on the uneven gravel as he ran toward the porch. Daniel was standing near the steps with Detective Mark Ellison, who turned toward Eleanor as she approached. He gave a respectful nod. "Mrs. Grant," Ellison said quietly, "you came just in time." Inside the lodge, chaos had unfolded into order. 2 men, Kayla's accomplices, were already handcuffed in the main hall, their duffel bags open on the floor, stuffed with cash, electronics, thumb drives, and documents hastily taken from Thomas's office. Kayla herself stood against the wall, wrists secured behind her back, her face blotched with anger and fear. Officers sifted through the contents of her oversized purse, envelopes of cash, Eleanor's jewelry box, and a bundle of property papers she had tried to shove into the lining. When she saw Eleanor, Kayla's expression twisted. "You don't understand," she screamed. "He promised me we'd be gone before anyone knew. He said you were too stupid to notice." "Kayla," one officer warned sharply, tightening his grip on her arm. But Kayla kept talking, her voice cracking under pressure. "He told me. He said the lodge would be sold in days. He said you'd sign anything if he left the papers with you after dinner." Thomas crashed through the doorway at that exact moment, breathless, voice trembling. "Kayla, stop talking. Don't say another word." Detective Ellison stepped forward calmly. Mr. Thomas Grant. Thomas froze. I'm Detective Ellison with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. You're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and attempted unlawful transfer of real property. What? Thomas backed away, shaking his head. No, you don't understand. This is all a misunderstanding. Eleanor, tell them. Tell them you don't want this. Tell them. He reached toward her. Eleanor didn't move. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended, every sound fading except Thomas's ragged breathing. Deputies stepped in, turning Thomas around and securing his wrists in handcuffs. Kayla watched, eyes wide, as the man she had counted on fell apart in front of her. Thomas's voice broke. Eleanor, don't let them do this. 43 years. You can't let. The officers guided him toward the exit. Eleanor remained still, not angry, not triumphant, just finished. Daniel stood beside her but didn't touch her. He understood this moment belonged to her alone. The door closed behind Thomas, the echo settling through the lodge like the final punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. 43 years of marriage didn't collapse with screaming. They collapsed with a quiet exhale and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. 1 year passed, and the seasons moved through the Rockies with their usual quiet certainty. Winter's heavy silence, spring's melt, the slow reawakening of the forests. All of it washed over Grant Mountain Lodge like a slow, steady cleansing. The chaos of that night, the flashing lights, the broken voices, they all felt distant now, softened by time and by the humbling work of rebuilding. The court proceedings had been long, heavy, and public. Eleanor attended only when required. She sat in the back row each time, hands folded, face composed, watching the unraveling of what had once been a life built over 4 decades. Thomas received a prison sentence. Not symbolic, not lenient, real time, measured in years rather than months. Kayla faced multiple charges of attempted theft, conspiracy, and possession of stolen property. Her courtroom demeanor shifted from defiance to exhaustion, her once perfect poise replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had run out of scripts. Most of the money wired overseas was recovered after a cooperative effort with federal investigators. Not all, but enough to stabilize the lodge and reverse the damage that might have destroyed it entirely. Through it all, Eleanor remained steady. Not hardened, not vindictive, simply resolute. She and Daniel worked side by side through every hearing, every reconstruction plan, every meeting with contractors. They stripped the lodge back to its bones, fixing what had been neglected for years, repainting walls, repairing staircases, opening the windows to let the mountain air reclaim the rooms. By early summer, the lodge lived again. Guests returned, some out of loyalty, some out of curiosity, but what they found was a place quieter and warmer than before, touched by something resilient. The sound of laughter drifted through the halls again. The fireplace burned late into the evenings, and the mountains wrapped everything in their familiar, ancient calm. One afternoon, as thunderheads gathered over the ridge, a woman arrived at the lodge unannounced. She introduced herself quietly. I'm Linda Monroe, she said, Kayla's mother. Eleanor guided her to the porch. The woman's hands trembled around a cup of tea she barely touched. Her voice cracked as she apologized, not for her daughter's crimes, but for the blindness she herself carried for so long. She wasn't always like this, Linda whispered. Or maybe she was, and I didn't want to see it. I'm sorry you became part of her spiral. The conversation was painful, strangely gentle, and deeply human. When the woman left, Eleanor stood for a long time on the porch, watching the storm move in, not angry, not relieved, just aware of how many lives had been touched by a single line crossed. Later that summer, a letter arrived from the correctional facility. Thomas's handwriting, uneven, unfamiliar, as if written by someone whose confidence had drained out of him entirely. He apologized, not cleverly, not manipulatively, just remorseful. A broken man facing the quiet truth of what he had done. Eleanor waited until evening to open it fully. She carried it into the garden behind the lodge, where the aspen trees shimmered in the breeze and the mountains hummed softly in the distance. She read every word, letting the weight of it settle without resistance. She did not cry. She did not smile. She did not answer. Instead, she folded the letter gently and set it beside her, because this was not a story of revenge shouted through the halls. It was a story of acceptance, of breathing again, of finding peace not in victory, but in quiet freedom, reclaimed one soft, deliberate moment at a time.